All right, to get us started, I'm curious to ask, should we think about Socrates as the godfather of Stoicism?
We might as well. Like, I think some of the Stoics did. So I think Epictetus clearly idolizes Socrates, and he says repeatedly to his students that they should emulate Socrates in their own lives. He's their main role model. Epictetus mentions Socrates twice as often, if I remember rightly, as he mentions Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. How weird is that? So sometimes he says, yeah, you guys should ask yourself what Zeno would do in this situation, but he refers twice as often to Socrates. So definitely that Stoic. Seneca, Marcus Aurelius hold Socrates in high regard, but don't go on about him to the same extent. There's another fragment somewhere that mentions that the Stoics viewed themselves as a Socratic sect. It's very much part of the Socratic tradition. So I think it's fair to view it that way, although it's possible that not all Stoics. I think Stoicism is more diverse than people normally assume. And Stoicism flourished for 500 years, right? So, I think there were we know that there were different branches of Stoicism. It's split into different branches at least twice, once at the beginning and once towards the end of that period. And we know of about 60 or 70 famous Stoic teachers and authors in the ancient world. So I don't think all of them viewed Socrates necessarily as the godfather. But Epictetus did, and he's probably the most influential Stoic teacher from our perspective today. We're told that Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, was inspired to become a philosopher because he sat down at a bookshop in Athens and began reading book 2 of Xenophon's Memorabilia. So Xenophon is an Athenian general. He's one of Socrates' friends and students. We still have about 40 of his dialogues. They're less famous than Plato's dialogues, but they may be equally important to the Stoics and perhaps even more important. So what is in book 2 of the Memorabilia Socrates? Well, there's a famous speech called The Choice. We call it the Choice of Hercules today. And it's kind of a speech, an exhortation that's meant to inspire young men to become philosophers and pursue the life of virtue. So it's not surprising that Zeno might have heard that and thought, that's it. I'm going to follow this advice and go off and embrace the life of philosophy. So, yeah, I think we should view him in that way. I say, and sometimes it seems like in Stoicism what we get is a kind of bullet point list of ideas, but we don't, as many people observe, we often don't really get the arguments that justify some of the Stoic ideas. We get fragments of arguments and we can infer some of them. But the kind of genres of writing that we have from the Stoics are not intended to provide the arguments. And often the arguments would be very familiar to people like Marcus Aurelius. They're 500 years old. He's heard them a zillion times. So in his personal notes, he's not going to go rehash like the arguments that justify his virtue ethics. Seneca's writing letters or essays. Epictetus is engaging with kind of these free-form discussions with his students. There probably were other Stoic texts that explain the basics. In Cicero's De Finibus, we get the closest thing to a lecture on Stoic ethics. But it's not widely read today. But all of those Stoics would be familiar with the sort of arguments you get in Plato's dialogues. So in Socrates, you get these much more long-winded, like laying the foundations, laying the groundwork. For instance, in Euthydemus, one of Plato's dialogues, we get an argument, which I'll just recount briefly because it's pretty simple. Socrates asks his interlocutor, the guy he's talking to, what the good life would consist in, like what the ideal, the optimum life would consist in. And Socrates usually begins with a question that seems like a no-brainer, as we say today. Like, that's why people sometimes made fun of him for asking naive or silly questions. So they say, well, what's a good life consist in? And this guy says, well, it's easy, Socrates, having loads of money and being good looking and, coming from a powerful family and having a nice house and all this kind of stuff, right? And Socrates says, well, wouldn't like wisdom and virtue and stuff like that figure in it? And he says, well, yeah, like that as well, kind of like as an afterthought. And Socrates says, well, hang on a minute. Like, let's start with wealth. Surely, if you take a big pile of money and give it to someone that's wise and virtuous, that's a good thing. They could do more wise and virtuous stuff with all that money. But what if you took a big pile of money and gave it to somebody who was foolish and vicious? Wouldn't it just allow them to do more foolish and vicious stuff? I mean, what if you gave a big pile of money to a genocidal tyrant? Like, wouldn't it allow them to do like really bad things, like horrible things? I mean, doesn't the money just give you more opportunity to control your environment and influence other people? And that could be good or bad depending on your character and the way that you use it. And so his interlocutor agrees with that. And Socrates basically, long story short, says, this is true of all the other external advantages that you've named, though. None of them are intrinsically good, but they all depend on your character and the use that you make of them, right? And this argument that externals are indifferent and become only good or bad sort of instrumentally depending on the way that we use them is one of the foundations of Stoic virtue ethics. But I don't think it's clearly spelled out in any of the surviving Stoic texts, but all of the Stoics would be familiar with the argument in the mouth of Socrates from the dialogues of Plato.
Are there any Stoic practices that we might think of today, as something from Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus that, really should connect back to Socrates?
Gosh, let me think. Well, the most obvious thing would be the Socratic method, right? Which we don't see much of in Marcus Aurelius, although there's a little bit of it. But we see it in Epictetus. Like, we see him actually using the Socratic method and very much using it as a kind of psychological therapy. Basically, there's a famous example where a Roman official comes to him and he said his daughter was ill. They thought she was dying. He implies she had a tumor or something like that. And he freaks out and abandons her bedside because he can't handle the anxiety of watching his little girl die. And Epictetus engages in a Socratic dialogue with this guy, not about Plato's theory of forms or some abstract thing, but about whether it was the right thing for him to do to abandon his daughter's bedside. And he uses another tool that we use in cognitive therapy today, which is, among other things, he appeals to something we call the double standard strategy. So at one point in the argument, he says, suppose you were ill. Like, would you want your wife and kids to abandon your bedside and leave you like to die on your own? And he's like, obviously not. And he says, well, then why do you think that's the right thing to do, like, towards them? And, it's a contradiction. You're being hypocritical. Like, so he uses the Socratic method to expose these contradictions in this guy's moral thinking because he's applying a double standard to his own conduct versus the conduct of other people. And that's something that's very explicit in Socrates, but we also see Epictetus making use of that. I think we underestimate perhaps how important the Socratic method may have continued to be for the Stoics. So most people that are into Stoicism don't really use techniques like that. They read Marcus Aurelius and think of it more in terms of contemplative practices as kind of almost a solitary thing, whereas Socrates thought we have to be talking to other people. Socrates talked to other people, engaged in philosophical dialogue all day long. It would be no exaggeration to say he's portrayed as doing philosophy all day long every day. Like, I mean, even like right up to the minute when he drinks the hemlock in prison, in court. Like, when he's supposed to be on trial, he subverts the trial in a way by standing in the middle of the court and actually doing the Socratic method with one of the people that's bringing the charges against him. So that, I think, is something we should attribute to Socrates. There are lots of, what we tend to find, some of the other techniques, there are kind of like traces of in Plato and Xenophon, like the view from above, for example. Amor fati, maybe even premeditation of adversity, we can find like traces of, although I don't think they're usually kind of as upfront and explicit as we find them in the later Stoic texts. I think often the Stoics are taking ideas that you find in Socrates and other Greek philosophy, and then over the space of 500 years, they're developing them more, like, taking what might just be a passing comment and developing it into like a whole systematic exercise that's by the time of Marcus Aurelius become much more familiar to them.
There's lots of people listening that are obviously embarking on this Stoicism in a year project. And we're exploring, the original well-known Stoic texts, but are there portions of Plato that should be included in some of these daily meditations? If so, like, what's a must-read from Plato for someone interested in Stoicism?
Well, first of all of it, right? But that's a
Yeah.
tall order, right? Because some of it is not much fun to read if you're a newcomer. Like Plato's Republic is quite long. It consists of 10 dialogues. So it's kind of hard going. So I can give you some pretty specific advice about this. I like to say to people that I don't normally recommend books, right? I think it's an individual thing. I think most books are too long. Like nowadays, people want to kind of get the key information more quickly. So I don't recommend reading specific books unless I know someone quite well, and I think I'm definitely know that this book would match your needs. But I make one exception to that, and that is that I think every man, woman, and child should read Plato's Apology, because it's not that long, and it's really easy to read, and it's widely available, free of charge, and it's one of the most influential and important and profound texts on philosophy in the Western canon. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus would have known it almost by heart. Like it would be extremely familiar. They're taking it for granted, and they're often kind of alluding to it. In fact, the last sentence, funnily enough, of the Enchiridion, the handbook of Epictetus, alludes to Plato's Apology, for instance. Like it's there. It's like almost like the Bible or something to them, right? It's like they just take it for granted as a foundation of like a lot of what they're doing. And it's not like a lecture on philosophy. It's more like a little courtroom drama. But there's lots of, I know that I'm gradually realizing that some people find that odd at first because they're kind of expecting a lecture on philosophy. But I think it gets its claws into you, and you might read it at first and think, what was that all about? Maybe the Socrates guy deserved to be like executed. He's being a bit kind of like offhand towards the jurors and stuff. But there's just fleeting ideas, like, and little turns of phrase in it that are like seeds of a lot of later philosophy, and that kind of stick in your mind, and should get you thinking. And for some people, they'll read it and it'll be one of the most profound and inspirational things that they've ever read. Even if someone hates it and they think they get nothing from it, they've wasted like 2 hours because it's not that long. It's pretty easy to read. So I think everyone should read Plato's Apology. Secondly, funnily enough, everything about Socrates is paradoxical, right? I try to avoid using the word paradox or irony because I end up using it in every sentence I find when I'm talking about. So everything about him seems to become quite paradoxical. Paradoxically, even though I think reading Plato's Republic is not a good place to start because it gets quite abstract, and it's quite long, and it's got a lot of stuff about the theory of forms and stuff that's probably Plato inserting his ideas into Socrates. There's an exception to that, which is it's divided into 10 books, and the first book is generally thought by scholars to have been written at an earlier stage, and the other 9 books were maybe added later. The first book seems like it's kind of standalone. It's more dramatic, like there's more interaction between the characters in it. It covers a wider range of subjects. It's simpler, and it looks more like the kind of thing that Plato wrote earlier in his career, where he was maybe representing Socrates in a more authentic way. It's also closer to what we have in Xenophon's dialogues. So when there's common ground between Plato and Xenophon, some people think, well, that looks like it's probably more likely to be what Socrates actually said. And when Plato goes off into discussing the theory of forms and things like that, people think that's probably Plato's stuff, like that he's putting into the mouth of Socrates. So the first book of Plato's Republic And then if you like that kind of thing, the Symposium is also a masterpiece. The Euthydemus is harder going, but it's very relevant to Stoicism. But Plato's Apology also has a lot of stuff in it that should be familiar to people that read the Stoics, like just passing comments or ideas or images that the Stoics are kind of have in their mind, and like Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Seneca are kind of have this scene in their mind often when they're describing things and talking to their students. I mean, if in a way Epictetus doesn't talk that much about what Socrates says. He's talking to his students more about what Socrates does and the type of person that he is. He's like, look at the type of guy he is, how he faced death. So it's the example of his life and the way he behaved in court that is a reference point for Epictetus. So that's why I think partly the Apology is an important starting point. And then, for kind of like what's the expression, like a deep cut, there's a pseudo-Platonic text called the Axiochus that I really like. That's probably maybe harder to find. I'm sure you can find it online, and it's got a lot of stuff about contemplating your own mortality, which I think would be very interesting to Stoics. It's put in the mouth of Socrates, but perhaps probably wasn't written by Plato himself. So that's the stuff. But I think also people should read Xenophon's memorabilia. His dialogues are much shorter. They're easier to read. Xenophon's Apology. If you're going to read Plato's Apology, you should probably read Xenophon's as well. His account of what happened in court. And then if you read Plato's Symposium, you might as well read Xenophon's Symposium as well. It's a similar text, but a slightly different portrayal of Socrates. And the memorabilia contain, I think, some of the dialogues that are most similar to modern cognitive therapy. Like, I think as a therapist, I'm more interested in Xenophon than some classicists or philosophers might be, because we're not talking so much about the theory of forms and metaphysics. In Xenophon, that doesn't feature. We're talking more about anger, and greed and self-control, and just dealing with everyday human traits. So it's closer to psychotherapy in many regards.